entornos que han recorrido ya más camino que nosotros siempre es interesante. De ahí podemos aprender, podemos copiar, podemos mimetizar o sencillamente podemos desechar. Pero como mínimo parece absolutamente necesario el saber qué es lo que se hace y cuáles han sido las experiencias y los desarrollos. En ese sentido, yo creo que no podemos tener mejores ponentes que los que me flanquean hoy para saber cómo funcionan las cosas en algunos de los mercados más desarrollados en esta materia, como es el mercado británico y como es el mercado holandés. Nos explicará algunas cosas sobre el mercado británico Jennifer Walmsley. Ella es director de Engagement de Hermes. Y sobre el mercado holandés, un ya viejo conocido, Giuseppe van der Helm, que es director ejecutivo de VBDO y presidente de Eurosif, nos va a dar un poco su opinión, su punto de vista sobre el mercado británico, las principales líneas sobre el mercado británico. Vamos a ir mezclando idiomas para que para ellos también sea más fácil. Y luego trataremos de dejar un tiempo para las preguntas finales. So, thank you very much, both of you, for coming today. Well, maybe first of all, we'd like to know something about your respective markets, a brief overview of SRI practices and how are main strategies applied in your respective markets. I don't know, maybe Jennifer, do you like to start?
Happy to. Good morning, everybody. Very pleased to be here with you today to hopefully share a few insights from the UK market. The buzzword in the UK at the moment is really long-term and long-termism, and very much of the debate is around how to get the financial markets to behave in a more long-term way. And the feeling is very much that if we could solve this issue and if we could move to a long-term approach, then a lot of the problems that we've seen over recent years, the banking crisis, the financial crisis, if we could get to a more long-term approach, then those problems would not recur. So if I take you back to 2010, so just over 3 years ago, the Financial Reporting Council in the UK, which is the body that regulates company reporting, published something called the Stewardship Code, which many of you may be familiar with. This got an awful lot of attention both in the UK and globally because this was the first time that a body that was responsible for regulating corporate reporting sought to regulate how investors are behaving. And there were two key elements of the Stewardship Code, or two key aims. The first of those was to encourage a more long-term approach to investment. And the second was to encourage investors to engage with companies where necessary in order to foster better corporate performance. So did it work? Well, if we look at the barrage of initiatives that we've seen over the last few years in the UK and elsewhere, all promoting or trying to promote long-term behaviour. So we had the Cox Review, the Kay Review, the Ownership Commission, the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards, not to mention all of the efforts more internationally, so efforts by the OECD, by the EC, by the Financial Stability Board. And the answer has to be a resounding no. It didn't work very well because we're still talking about long-termism and how to get to more of a long-term approach. So short-termism still is rife in financial markets, and this has many negative impacts on the way in which market participants behave, and it includes the negative impact of poor corporate ownership. So a lot of the debate in the UK is around long term. So what we're trying to do at Hermes is to solve what we see as a fundamental disconnect in the market, because very many asset owners invest via fund managers, so they give a portion of their assets to a group of different fund managers. Those fund managers go out and invest, but those fund managers themselves are often incentivized on short-term performance. So if you think about the type of conversations they're having with companies, then inevitably those conversations are going to be around how to get the best investment performance over the short term, rather than looking at the longer term, which is the time horizon that the asset owners themselves often have in mind. So what we're trying to do is to fill that gap. At Hermes, we're an amalgamation of global pension funds, and those pension funds have decided to pool resources. And the idea is that we have one high-quality conversation rather than lots of smaller funds, perhaps struggling to get access to corporates and perhaps having lower quality conversations because they don't have the resources. So we're very much about having board-level conversations, trying to fill the gap in this circle of communication or lack of communication between fund managers and corporates, and really trying to sort of move the whole dialogue onto a more long-term basis. So to summarise, in the UK there's a lot of focus at the moment on long-termism and on better stewardship as the key components of socially responsible investment. But there are lots and lots of disconnects and conflicts in the market. And just to take one recent example, the K review, which was the government review looking at how to solve short-termism, suggested that investors come together and form an investor forum. And this is supposed to be a group that discusses issues that are of key importance to do with UK companies and does engagement jointly and conveys views to companies on a collaborative basis. This is still stuck at the kind of thinking process. There's a working group, but the working group includes lots and lots of investment managers, and those investment managers are just very conflicted. They don't want to share their ideas with other investment managers. They want to keep their best ideas for themselves. And so what we really need to do there is to get the asset owners themselves involved. And I think that if we could bring together the asset owners, that would be a much more effective collaborative body than trying to get investment managers to work together, with huge apologies to all the investment managers in the room, who I'm sure, because you're here today, you clearly are taking a more long-term approach to what you're doing. But it is a big problem in the UK, just trying to solve this issue of short-termism. So that's very, very briefly an overview of main characteristics currently.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I recognize a lot of things, actually. So, yeah. I recognize a lot of things because there's some similarities between the UK and the Netherlands. Just before I start painting a quick picture of the financial market, let me first talk to you about a particularity of the Dutch culture. I'm not sure how many of you heard of the polder model, but a polder is a piece of land below the water, like half of our country. And when there's a risk that your country will be flooded, you don't start to discuss a lot. So you'll just have to work together. And it doesn't matter if you have a lot of money or not a lot of money, we all share the same problem. And basically this model stands for something that we have the tendency to discuss. There's an openness from different parties which is not obviously not always there in other countries. Like, let's take for instance France, it's a safe bet, it's not Spain, it's not Holland. It will be hard as an NGO or somebody with 3 shares to get access to the board of a large corporate. In Holland, that's not so hard. And the same thing applies for investors, more or less. So this is kind of the general culture in which you should see whatever is happening. In that case, I think long-termism is more important, and it's also and that makes sense, because in the Dutch context, pension funds are very relevant. You know, we have a system where we all save money for our own pension, which means that on total pension fund assets in Holland is close to 1 trillion euros. That's a lot of money. And this is long-term money, obviously. So the tendency is there. What you also see is that there is a tendency at the banks to be more mainstream. And you get together the different elements. Very often the combination, as I showed in the previous presentation, of exclusion or ESG integration combined with engagement. So this is kind of the setup that's happening. Asset owners, an important chunk of the market. The big banks try to, let's say, go a bit to the responsible way, but responsible is not the same as sustainable. So for instance, if you look to the Rabobank, one of the third large banks in Holland, they would say, well, all our money has to be invested responsibly. If you come to us, you can only invest money responsibly. What does that mean? They have one exclusion on controversial weapons. They have engagement. They ask they deal only with PRI signatories, and they base their work on a global compact with the selection of the companies. So that's what they claim, that's what they do. So we, with our 3 shares, for instance, as VBDO, wanted to go to buy shares of EADS, Airbus Industries. It wasn't possible. It wasn't possible, because in their policy they were excluded, because there was some hints to controversial weapons. So this is kind of the Dutch overview. I wanted to add what you were saying about the disconnect, because I feel the same disconnect that Jennifer is feeling. And that's logical, perhaps, because as you move ahead, you'll find that it doesn't work as planned, so to say. There's one disconnect, for instance, what companies say and what they do. Let's take the largest bank of Holland, ING. They have a great sustainable report. And I'm in a jury that has to rate all those reports in Holland for a prize on transparency, and I was kind of impressed. But then I read their real report, the real financial annual report. Gee, did I have to look for the word sustainability, or responsible investment, or CSR, or SRI, or ESG? Those words you couldn't find. There was one small paragraph, the CEO, that said, well, we have signed the principles for sustainable insurance. Great, so what does that mean? We couldn't find that. And for the rest, just 2 of these paragraphs in a 150-page report. Like, really, literally like this. And that showed the real disconnect. Apparently, the people with ING that do sustainability, that care about SRI or ESG, that implement those things, have nothing, really nothing to do with what's happening in the boardroom. They are really far away from integrating it. And I've been to those shareholder meetings. Those were rooms that were probably 10 times as big as this room. And ING is the only company that put sustainability as a separate point on the agenda. When that point started, the whole room was emptied. Everybody went for a coffee or a beer or whatever. So yes, on paper, it's perfect, but in reality, how close it is to your heart. And if I may mention 2 more disconnects. One I think you raised also. It's between the owners, the asset owners, and the asset managers. I once had a presentation for a pension fund about our benchmark, and I'll tell you a bit more later. And at the end of the presentation, where I explained them what sustainable investment is and why did you do it, and they said, ooh, that sounds good. He said, yeah, but in your benchmark, obviously we aren't there. And I said, no, you were there. And actually, you're not doing very bad either. You're somewhere halfway in the top 50 of the pension funds. Oh, wow. And one time at the table was smiling, and that was their asset manager. He had filled in all those things, those questions. He had taken care of that. There is something like a sustainability policy. The board of that pension fund didn't know zilch. They had no idea, no clue what was happening, no clue what it was. And that's also a real disconnect. You know, the owners of the money and, let's say, the person that has to take care of it, there's a disconnect with regard to sustainability, the knowledge, the idea, the awareness. And then finally, there's a disconnect between the legislation. In spite of what I said in my previous presentation about remarks from the Dutch National Bank and from the financial authorities, there's a real disconnect. Because there are safeguards in our legislation and the regulations that are from the past. They do not work anymore, but they are still there. I'll give you an example. At this moment in time, the Dutch National Bank rates it more safe to invest in derivatives than in an FSC plantation somewhere. That doesn't make sense in the world where we live now, in the past, but not now anymore. The Dutch National Bank asks pension funds to report every half year on their doings, what are their alpha is. But that's crazy, because if you do it every half year, you only have to pay out on average in 20 years. Hey, how do you direct your asset managers? They will be rewarded on their short-term results. Exactly the opposite of what a pension fund needs, and we think, of course, the market needs. So there are a lot of disconnects, and what we are trying to do, of course, as a Sustainable Investment Forum, is to work to resolve those disconnects and to get them out of the system.
The second question is related to pension funds. So how are your experience in developing SRI practices on pension funds? Maybe we can talk about who makes the decision. Is the board, is the pension fund manager, is the sponsor of the plan? Is there any specific SRI settlement of policy? In this case, is a detailed one, is a global, so who and how controls in each pension plan or in each pension fund? And finally, if you know if there is a special feeling of the members, of the participants of pension funds about SRI. Maybe Giuseppe, sure. Some things have you responded previously, but maybe...
Yes, yes. Well, so basically I already told you some of the problems. Now let's look to the solutions. I always like stories, so let's start with your question, like who is controlling it? The answer is us. Let's say the Dutch CIF is doing that. How? I'll tell you. 7 years ago, there was a broadcast which got a prize in Holland. It's called Zembla, and it was about the pension funds. Did they invest in cluster ammunition, for instance? Yes, they did. And their directors were shown on tape, and they really made a mess explaining why they did that. They couldn't explain, of course. And instead of saying, well, I'm sorry, we didn't know, or we'll investigate, and they said, no, it's not true, or it's part of the policy, or whatever. So the anger became higher. And I was in that broadcast, by the way. It was another topic, but speaking about engagement of pension funds, which was not in line with the policies. So at the end of the day, of course, they needed the black sheep to blame it all on, all the noise, because in society, in Dutch society, this created a lot of turmoil. And then they blamed me, of course. And then yeah, you have to have someone. So that didn't do so good to the CIF. But what he said at that time is, we have to make care. And one of the directors came on television and he said, yeah, but what is really sustainable investment? And although I thought he knew quite well what it was, I still thought that's a good thing for a CIF to discover. What is it? So we developed our first benchmark, sustainable investment for pension funds. Mm-hmm. And basically, very briefly, we looked to the policy, we looked to implementation, and how they report, how they take the responsibility at the end of the day. And it's so funny that we started at a time where where we had this kind of troubled relationship, perhaps. Now, after 7 years, we have a response rate this year, for the first time, of 100%. 100%. All pension funds participate to this survey. And yes, they're going to use the results. Now, what is the result of this? Not only do you outline, do you get an agreement on what is sustainable investment and how do you measure it, but also you give the feedback to the pension funds because they give the profiles. It's totally transparent. Mm-hmm. Now, the results, when we started with that thing, only 50% of the pension funds, less than 50%, had even a policy. Now it's close to 100%, 95% that has a policy. And you see the same movement upwards on implementation and on reporting of that thing. Mm-hmm. What you also see on the disconnect between asset owners and asset managers is that asset owners use this thing more and more as a real benchmark. Because they tell their asset managers, listen, I'm now on number 45. Next year I want to be in the 35. And I've heard more and more examples of this, that actually they use it as a means of objective setting. Last or 2 weeks ago in the EuroSIF annual event, we had a person from a UK pension fund speak, and he said, yeah, we think we're doing very well on sustainable investment, but we don't know because there's no benchmark. Well, there is a benchmark. And by the way, you're free to use it because this is typically CIF material, and it's all in English, and it's all available, so you can use it in your own country to set up something similar. But this is something that brings clarity, it brings things out in the open, it's very transparent, every pension fund and all the others can see it, and it can be used to see where you are, how you can improve. So that's probably a pretty good thing. Just one final remark on the pension funds, because you mentioned governance or legislation and participants. Participants, let's say if there's a real disconnect, out of all the things that remain is between participants and the pension funds. In general, but perhaps you can correct me, perhaps I'm wrong, but what I see is they're usually in a kind of isolation. in an ivory tower. It's not that they want to be there often, but sometimes they don't know how to do it. Perhaps they don't have the resources. Perhaps there's other reasons. But the communication between a pension fund and a participant is really, really low. And if there is communication, it's usually with a nice picture. They don't talk a lot about sustainability, but then they have another picture of usually of young girls in white dresses on green lawns. They are walking and running and playing, and that's about sustainability. Well, sustainability is about, of course, about impact and of data and of things you really achieve. And I believe that as we build that bridge between the asset owner and the asset managers, the asset owners should really make a big effort to reach out to their participants, ask what they want, what they care for, and show their results of what they're doing. And that way you can be proud of your pension funds. And something like stakeholder dialogue, we organize stakeholder dialogues for companies. We never did one for pension funds, and I think that could be a great tool too. Now, as for legislation, in Holland we had a new legislation that was not yet in Francisco's presentation. As of 1st of July, we have a legislation for boards of pension funds. Yeah. And what does it say? They are obliged to have a policy on non-financial matters, and they have to report on it. And that also means that they have to build on the knowledge and the awareness of it. So that could also be a strong tool. But as usual, legislation follows what's already happening to some extent, you know? But it makes it a bit easier to go and talk to those pension funds.
Is it quite similar in the UK or not?
It's not entirely dissimilar. I mean, pension funds in the UK have had, for many years, they've had to, under their Statement of Investment Principles, set out their approach to sustainability. But there's a lot of discussion at the moment around the whole concept of fiduciary responsibilities. And the Law Commission in the UK is working on it's doing a study into how you can, as a pension fund trustee, take account of issues around sustainability and how that fits with your fiduciary duty to maximise the returns from the pension fund. So there's a lot of discussion around that at the moment. And you know, some of this goes back to the issue that's just been raised around how do you, as pension fund trustees, know what the beneficiaries actually want. And in some cases, I think it's clearer than others. So, for example, one of the pension funds in our group is the Environment Agency in the UK. And it's very clear that the Environment Agency and the beneficiaries of that fund are very concerned about environmental protection, so they're interested in climate change and water use and pollution and so on. And so for that fund, it's relatively straightforward to set what its priorities are going to be from an investment perspective. Another example of one of our clients is a fund that represents the pension funds of Danish nurses. And so they also have some very clear imperatives from the membership to not invest in certain companies. So they were very interested in getting us to engage around the components of lethal injections and the companies that made those, and making sure that those companies were being sure about who their customers were and where those products were going. So in some cases, I think it's relatively straightforward for trustees to say, well, you know, this is the makeup of our members in general. We know that they will have some priorities. We know that they will want us to do this or that. And it's relatively straightforward to then translate that into a sustainable investment policy, because you're safe in the knowledge that you are doing the right thing by your members. For other funds that have a more general membership with a broader range of interests, that isn't always so easy to do. But one of the clear trends we are seeing, not just in the UK but also across Europe, is corporate sponsors that have their own strong corporate responsibility program are wanting to make sure that what the pension fund is doing is in line with what the corporate's doing. So we work, for example, with a large UK bank, which is very keen to make sure that the pension fund isn't investing in anything that the bank would not finance itself. So they have a set of principles building on the Equator principles, and they want to make sure that that is also carried across to the pension fund, so that the pension fund doesn't invest in companies that make controversial weapons, in companies that are doing mountaintop mining, and you know, a whole range of other things. So that's a very interesting trend that we're seeing coming through. Also corporates that have had problems, so we work for a large corporate that has had many issues around bribery and corruption, and so for them it was really important that the pension fund was also whiter than white in the way in which it was investing and the way in which it was living up to its responsibilities as an owner. So those are sort of a couple of trends that I'd just note in the UK market.
Thank you, Jennifer. Third question is about UNPRI. Pension funds and pension funds managers as well are usually underwriters of UNPRI. And how far is the level of use of the different advantages that UNPRI offers? Jennifer, please.
Well, I think the UNPRI is an aspirational set of principles, I think. So, you know, if you look at what's in the UNPRI, if you were to live fully up to those responsibilities, they're really quite significant. So a lot of funds, I think, have signed the principles, and you know, they sign them, and then the board goes back and says to the people on the ground, okay, we've signed the principles, this is what we're going to do. And you know, the people on the ground responsible for implementing those sort of look at the principles and go, oh gosh, right, we have to do that now. So you know, I think there's an awful lot of work involved in fully implementing the principles. I also think that you know, we hear from a lot of our members who are signed up to the principles that actually complying with them and then doing the survey that needs to be done to show how you're complying is actually quite a lot of work. So you know, we hear quite a lot of concern about the onerous nature of the PRI survey. So at particular times of the year, there are funds who don't necessarily see it as an advantage to be signed to the PRI because of the weight of the information that they have to provide around reporting. So they really are quite tough requirements. And I would say that particularly when it comes to the principle that talks about integration and integrating responsible investment principles, I would say that a lot of funds are really just at the beginning of thinking about how they can do that, and a lot of that comes back to the fact that they're relying on their fund managers to do the work for them, and then you get back into the problem of short-term incentivization for those investment managers, which means that they're not necessarily thinking about how to integrate ESG, because a lot of those factors involve taking a really long-term approach to the investments, which just isn't currently in their mindset.
Yeah, thank you. Well, perhaps let's first talk about the Dutch situation, where we have an association of, let's say, institutional investors called IMEDION, and most of them, I think, PRI signatories, and we work with them together. Perhaps I should use this opportunity also to paint a bit of the landscape of the SIFs, the Sustainable Investment for all across the world, because they have a relation to PRI. And some people ask me from time to time, how do you see that the relation between the two of them? You have to understand that the SIFs, we have 12 of them in Europe. They gather in EuroSIF, 9 of them. And then on the global level, there's a Global Sustainable Investment Alliance, which basically is the biggest SIFs of the world being together. But this is a virtual situation. A virtual association is a global thing. SIFs always work on the ground, because it's in countries that the legislation is being made. Still, even European legislation has to be adapted in the countries. It's there we have the local culture, like I spoke already about the Polder model. Every country has its own culture. It's there where you find really the people that have to implement it, where to do it. And you have to create a platform for literally for meeting and discussing and talking and seeing how you can implement and address the questions that you do address. So the thing is that the PRI has some aspirational principles. I think you framed that perfectly. And now they have to be implemented somewhere. And that's not so easy. The SIFs work the other way around. They work bottom up. They provide a local platform to meet in a multi-stakeholder setting, like in Spain, is I think the perfect setup between mainstream investors, retail investors, sustainable investors, civil society, data providers, accountants. It's a very broad basis, but they all have their input. They all can help. If one is stuck with the question, the other one can provide part of the answer. And because there's no end to the path, we're developing the path as we move on. To provide this platform is very important. Of course, the challenge for the SIFs is to share that data we have. And let me just in 2 minutes explain a bit how we work. You know how Spainsive works, but in the Netherlands, that perspective, we share the same ambition of addressing sustainability in capital markets through investments. And basically we do it at two sides. First of all, we work with the financial community, but we also work directly with companies. The second part, I'll tell a bit more about the first one. The second part is really a unique part to really talk directly. We have 3 shares of 75 listed companies. We visit a shareholder meeting every year. We analyze their reports and we go in and ask questions. They always get questions in advance. Companies in general appreciate that a lot. Paul Polman, CEO of Unilever, said last time when I asked the questions, thanks a lot, VBDO, because your work makes my life easier. Hey, why easier? Well, he said, because you talk to the other companies that are my suppliers, my customers, or whatever. And now they also understand the concept of sustainability and corporate responsibility. And at that company side, we work with 3 or 4 teams, and we also do research on that teams. So, for instance, we have human rights, we have biodiversity, sustainable remuneration, responsible tax policy. We don't ask a question to companies, but we do research, seeing what is legislation, what's happening for companies, for investors, what does civil society want, and what could you do? And then we bring them together. We organize a conference with 200 people talking together in detail about these things. So you provide this platform with your convening power to get people together and find solutions. And at the other side, at the financial side, exactly the same way. This is the meaning, the reason why we do these benchmarks on pension funds, but we also do one on insurances. So we help them to define the picture. We adapt methodology based on the input from the sector, obviously, because we want it to be useful. And then we do specific one-off research, like we have a research now on what is the impact of engagement. In fact, it's a kind of follow-up study, like we all do engage, but what's the impact? How do you measure that? How can you invest in food security? How can you work with ESG integration? What's a common definition? What's the best practices there? How do you work with a fixed income? How you deal with investing in occupied territories? There's a EU regulation now, so how do we deal with that as investors? So we do all kind of one-off research. All of this, by the way, is in English, and that helps with the implementation of those principles. So that's really the role of the, I think, the CIFs, the national CIFs. We share that research, and just at one last example, we also provide an analyst network. Both mainstream investors, portfolio managers, sustainable investors, analysts are welcome there. And we discussed, like, what do we deal with shale gas? What does it mean, the carbon bubble? How do we deal with fixed income or specific companies? So again, it's all about implementation. There's one thing I would like to add, and that is that you also, the CIF world can be also asking the questions to the signatories. Can be, in a very positive way, critical. Can be thinking a bit out of the box. You need, you always need a sparring partner, so to say. I think that's also a good role for the CIFs.
Thank you to defend the role of the CIFs.
No, defending.
To explain. Okay, thank you. Last question for each one. Giuseppe, as a chairman of EuroCIF, any additional thought about SRI development in Europe? Briefly, please.
Well, I would say read the SRI report. I think the connection, we spoke about the disconnection. Yeah. We spoke about the social contract. I think that we will construct that. I hope we will construct that. And I give you some examples, but the relationship between asset owners, asset managers, civil society, companies that talk more to their investors, and vice versa. I think that's an example where we see that bridge being built. The same thing with legislation that will facilitate things. And I think a key issue here is for asset owners to step up, to be outspoken. The PRI reporting really can help, but then it should be public. It should be transparent. People do need to see what they have done on the field of engagement. Words alone are not enough. It should be in the boardroom. It should be clearly translated in clear objectives and KPIs, and they should report on it. How did you vote in a specific meeting? What has been the impact of your way of investing, not only in a financial, also in a non-financial matter? So I think the ball really is in the park of those large investors, specifically the asset owners.
And Jennifer, could you briefly explain your policy vote, your policy about voting, please?
Yep, voting is something that's very, very important to our clients. They feel it's very important that they're represented at the shareholder meetings of the companies in which they own shares. So we devote a lot of resources within Hermes to making sure that we vote all of our clients' holdings. Our clients have between them over 10,000 companies in their portfolios. Clearly, we can't look in detail at 10,000 companies, so we work very closely with our proxy voting providers to set up bespoke warning systems. So we use those warning systems. We use also our history with the companies, so how we've voted in the past, whether we've had any engagement with companies, also obviously our the total holding that we represent. So we make sure that where we're over a certain percent, we always vote that with the right level of attention to detail. So we use a series of screens to bring that 10,000 companies down to a level that we can that we can vote with the team that we have. I mean, we have 25 engagement and voting professionals, so we have the largest team certainly in Europe. But nevertheless, 10,000 companies, they all need to be voted, but we need to use technology and our past involvement with those companies to identify those where there are likely to be problems so that we can really drill down and analyze what's going on at that company in detail. Whenever we see something on a company agenda that means that we're inclined to vote against, something that we're concerned about, we will contact the company in advance. So we'll call, we'll have a conversation with the company, we'll say to them, it seems to us that your remuneration policy, isn't entirely appropriate, or the balance of your board looks wrong. There doesn't seem to be enough independent representation on the board, and we will give the company an opportunity to say to us, to put its side of the story and to say, yes, we can understand why you might think that, but actually this is going on. We're about to make these changes to the board and we haven't been able to, or we're in the process of updating the remuneration policy, and why don't we meet again and talk about it in a couple of months' time. So if we get that sort of favourable response from a company, then we will usually vote in favour for the sake of having a good relationship and in the light of the dialogue that we've been promised. So we're very much about using the vote as a tool, because if you sit there at your desk and vote against at a particular company on the basis of something that you've seen, then where is the influence in that? We're one among lots of other investors. If the company even notices that we voted against, will they understand why we voted against? And so the vote in itself is a very blunt instrument. If you want to influence companies, it's important to back up the vote with lots and lots of dialogue and meetings and engagement. So that sort of very briefly is how we approach voting. But very happy to talk in more detail over lunch if any of you would like to talk about that a bit more.
Thank you, Jennifer. Si quieren hacer alguna cuestión antes de que cambiemos de panel, pues este es el momento. Sí le rogaría, en todo caso, la máxima brevedad a la hora de formular la cuestión. ¿Hay alguna pregunta? ¿Ya?
Well, as you've seen in the figures of the also the Joseph SRI study, ESG integration is a big thing, the biggest method, let's say, in Europe and also in the Netherlands is quite of a big area. The question, of course, is how do you do it in the right way? I remember in the analyst network that data providers had had given data, how to react in a certain specific case, and in both cases they were overruled in those examples by the investor, which is a good and a bad news. The good news is that they use their own brains and their own responsibility and their own assessment, which is good. The bad news is that it shows also there's no clear way how to handle with ESG integration. In the lowest form, it's not very meaningful, because you might do an investment and only afterwards look to, it's kind of fine-tuning of the selection. In a very tough form, it can of course be very very material on the ESG side. So that's why we now try to do this research. PRI's done the research also. We're also engaging in the research. What's actually good ESG integration? How can you see what's the best practice over there? How can you share it? Because you need to get to a kind of common standards. Again, this is kind of new. 10 years ago, we didn't speak about ESG integration. So you have to build a way as you go along.
I agree, it's a real challenge, and that's perhaps why we haven't talked about it as much this morning. I alluded to it when I talked about the principles being aspirational and quite difficult to meet, because they do talk about integration. That's right up there, integrating responsible and sustainable considerations. I think it's very difficult, and I don't think it's really happening in any sort of wholly convincing way at a lot of funds. One of the things that we do for our asset owners, which they find very, very helpful, is to screen their portfolio and identify where there are issues of potential concern across the portfolio. And that then enables the asset owner to go out and talk to the fund managers and say to the fund managers, we have this company in the portfolio, this company has been flagged for involvement in controversial weapons, in environmental breaches, in something else. How are you thinking about that in your investment decisions? How did you build that into your investment model? So just giving the asset owners the tools to be able to go out and have those conversations with the fund managers, I think is a very, very important thing to do. But I think we're a long way from any sort of proper integration in a lot of areas.
Well, so thank you very much, both of you, Giuseppe, Jennifer. Antes de finalizar esta parte, sí quería trasladarles nuestra enorme satisfacción por haber contado con ponentes de este nivel que nos han podido explicar con la brevedad que una jornada de este estilo requiere, pero con la amplitud también probablemente de puntos tratados. Nuestra satisfacción, digo, por haber podido contar con ellos y con sus opiniones, y gracias a ustedes por su paciencia con estos 5 minutos que nos hemos pasado el tiempo. Muchas gracias.